So if we could start with your full name, please.
John Carpenter Raaen, Jr.
And how do you spell that?
Well, the last name is spelled Raaen. It's a Norwegian name.
Okay. And where and when were you born?
I was born at Fort Benning, Georgia, April 22nd, 1922. And Fort Benning had been a fort for about 2 months when I was born. Before that, it was Camp Benning, all throughout World War II. But in February of 22, I think it was, they renamed it Fort Benning, and it grew in stature immensely.
So how old are you today?
97.
In which branch of the military did you serve in?
I served in the Army.
And which units did you serve, or were you attached to?
Well, the first actual service was at West Point in the Corps of Cadets. After that, my first actual unit was a platoon leader in B Company of the Engineer Training Regiment at Fort Belvoir. It was a basic training regiment, and they bring young men and old men in, and we would train them to be engineers in the Army.
And did you remain with them throughout the rest of your service?
Oh, heavens no. I stayed with them, I think it was 6 weeks, and went down to Fort Benning, where I had been born, and joined the 10th Armored Division. I was in the 55th Armored Engineer Battalion, a platoon leader in Company E, which was the bridge company of the battalion, of the division actually, because we had the only bridges.
And what years did you serve from and until?
Well, I served as a commissioned officer from 1943 to 1979.
And specifically speaking, your service during World War II, I understand you were attached to the 5th Ranger Battalion?
Yes, I was. After my initial assignment in the 10th Armored, we went on Tennessee maneuvers in the division, and they moved me over to be the reconnaissance platoon leader of the battalion. And this was a very interesting job, because as soon as we got to the maneuver area, Corps took the 90th Reconnaissance Squadron away from the division and made them Corps Reconnaissance. And it suddenly ended up that little old Second Lieutenant Johnny Raaen was the only reconnaissance element that they had, and I, in essence, became the division reconnaissance officer, replacing a 500-man squadron with my little 50-man platoon. It was a good job, believe me.
It's quite a jump in numbers.
It was quite a jump in prestige within the battalion, too, because I owned the extra Jeeps. And if there's anything that's a commodity that people want and can't get, it's transportation. So whenever somebody wanted to borrow a Jeep, they really had to come to me because there were no other Jeeps available, and I usually had 1 or 2 available. So I became very important in the life of particularly the love life of the division.
You were everybody's best friend then.
Everybody's best friend. But I brought in a lot of chips where people owed me.
And which campaigns did you participate in during
Well,
World War II?
Jumping many assignments ahead, I participated in the Normandy invasion. If you'll give me a moment.
Yep.
Now let's see, where were we? We just jumped ahead, and my first campaign was the Normandy campaign, and that was followed with, they called it Northern Europe, I believe, was the campaign, and I served mostly, well, I served in the Brest campaign, the Brittany campaign, which was not a separate campaign as far as battle stars and things like that. and then Rhineland, which was a battle star campaign. And it was there that the Battle of the Bulge occurred for me, and that ended my service there.
Okay. And what rank did you hold during these campaigns?
I was a captain. I had been a captain since just before we left the United States. And that is not true. I really didn't become a captain until April, just before the invasion. I had a company, but I was not a captain. I was a first lieutenant.
Did you receive any medals or awards for your service during any of those campaigns?
Yeah. I was awarded the Combat Infantry Badge, which is the thing that most infantrymen seek. I received the Silver Star for Normandy. I had 3 Bronze Star medals with V, and those were the decorations, if you want to call them that, for my service in World War II.
Okay, so I'd like to rewind a bit. I'd like to talk about your childhood growing up through the Great Depression.
Okay.
Your life.
Perfectly willing to. Born at Fort Benning, very early, certainly in less than 6 months, my father was ordered to the Canal Zone, where he served at Fort Clayton Canal Zone in the 33rd Infantry. He was a company commander there, and I, of course, was less than 1 year old. But I actually have memories going back to perhaps two years, and we stayed there for approximately 4 years. After no school, too young. I was no more than 4 and a half when we left. He was then stationed at West Point, but we lived in Newburgh, New York for the first 2 years of his assignment there. And the last 2 years we moved on post, lived in 2 separate places. And I went to 2nd and 3rd grades in the post school at West Point. Needless to say, a 5-year-old to 9-year-old at West Point, all he does is think about becoming a cadet because he's seeing cadets everywhere. You attend even at that age, you attend every football game, you attend every wrestling match. My father was officer in charge of wrestling, so I spent as much time in the wrestling room as I did anywhere else. And he was post-exchange officer, among other things. And as a result, I learned that I could get maple walnut ice cream cones and buttered pecan ice cream cones without having to pay for it, because the soldiers who were behind the counter would take care of the captain's, or actually the lieutenant's son. It was very nice. I'll tell you, the pre-war Army was a wonderful place to live and grow up in. After West Point, we went to, let's see, that's 3rd grade, 4th and 5th. Went to Raaen Arsenal, Metuchen, New Jersey. It no longer exists. I think they call it the Edison Research Center now. But was there for 4th and 5th grades. And at that point, I learned about ordnance. They had the Ordnance Enlisted School was there. So they also had a wonderful museum to teach them different small arms and things like that. They even had a couple of airplanes in the hangar because Ordnance had the armament on the airplane. So we got to sit in cockpits and move the joystick around. Our feet wouldn't reach the rudder controls or anything like that. But it was wonderful training, and it was a strictly Army ordnance. Went to civilian schools, but it was a wonderful assignment growing up. From there, went to Boston, where my father was stationed at Watertown Arsenal and MIT. He was getting a master's degree, which was necessary before he could become a real career ordnance officer. and I went to 6th grade there. Had some beautiful experiences. One of the most memorable was civics class, 6th grade civics. They took us on a tour to the city government in Boston, and there we met Boston's mayor. Let's see, what was his name? I'll think of his name, but in any event, where we met him was in the city prison. He was in a cell in jail, but he was still running the city. His secretary had a desk right outside the bars, and he had a desk with telephones inside his cell. And it was really quite an education in the American form of government, believe me. It got me intensely interested in civics for the rest of my life.
Wow.
So that was 6th grade. By 7th grade, we had moved to Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, which again was just 100% ordnance testing of small arms, of cannon. We lived in a place where we weren't 200 yards from what they call the main front, and that's where the cannons boom 24 hours a day. So we lived amidst the cannon fire and received tremendous amount of military education there, as well as having the best time in my life. It was just wonderful to be on a place like Aberdeen Proving Ground. Again, we went to civilian schools in town, and so we were not bereft of living the civilian life, because all of our classmates in school, of course, were civilians, sons and daughters, mostly of farmers, bankers, service station owners, the movie house owner, and things like that. Just a good cut of American society. From Aberdeen, my father was assigned to Washington, D.C., in the old munitions building. The Pentagon had not been built at that time. I continued getting military education. I remember one day I visited my father down in the munitions building, and he says, "I want you to go down to room blah-diddy blah blah blah." And I said, "Why?" I was a teenager. You always say why. And he said, "There's a rifle down there I want you to see. A man named Raaen has just developed a new rifle, and we're thinking about adopting it. This is a smaller caliber than the caliber we're adopting, but I want you to see it." So I got to go down and see one of the original Raaen prototypes. It was in .28 caliber, and it was just a beautiful little marvelous rifle. It became a more heavy and more ponderous rifle when they moved it up to caliber 30, which is what we standardized. And it was that rifle was the basic arm of the infantry in World War II. General Patton was asked after the war, "What weapon do you think won the war?" He did not say tanks. He said the M1 rifle. So I got in on the ground floor there. And it was interesting, when I was a major general, Henry Raaen died, and I wrote a letter of condolence to his wife. And I received a lovely reply from her, which in essence said, "Thank you, sir. You were the only government official to remember my husband died." And I thought that was a take on our modern civilian management of the military. At least the Secretary of Defense should have written her. But anyway, that is Aberdeen, and from Aberdeen, I was now in high school cadets, moved to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where my father attended the Command and General Staff School. It's since been named college. When I attended it much later, it was college. But that too was a marvelous place to grow up. Fort Leavenworth was a huge base. We not only had the military prison there, they called it the disciplinary barracks, but we had a federal prison on the grounds, and we had a state prison on the grounds. We had a squadron of cavalry, at least 2 troops, and we had a battalion of infantry, as well as the school itself. So we really got a taste of the Army life, and one of the most beautiful things I ever heard, I was a kid walking my dog, dead winter, cold, cloudless sky, full moon, cold as I say, and I suddenly heard the 17th Infantry's bugler playing taps. Well, now this is a haunting song, and it's just beautiful in itself, particularly that cold, crisp air. It came through that mile approximately, almost at full volume, and he was a perfect bugler. And I continued to walk the dog, and not 15 seconds later, the cavalry came in, a little tiny cavalry bugle, much higher frequency, and it played taps, and it did so beautifully, but it's sort of a squeaky sound. And then as I continued to walk the dog, the prison bugler came in, but he was playing a French horn, which was bass or baritone, and that just the three of those tapses was one of the most wonderful moments that I've ever spent as far as beauty. It was such a beautiful night, and those three renditions of taps were so beautiful. It's just a haunting memory. But Jesse James had robbed a train somewhere just off the reservation, and we used to go riding on Saturdays and go out there and see where Jesse James had robbed this train. Not 200 yards from where I lived, both the Santa Fe and the Oregon trails came up from the Missouri River, and you could still see the ruts of the wheels. The hill was so steep they had to winch the wagons up, and they ferried the horses or cattle, whichever it happened to be, down to where the airfield is now, and then walked them on up to meet the wagon. So it was a very, very interesting year. I was a junior in high school. First time I'd been interested in girls and that type of thing, and we had dances to take care of the teenagers and occupy them so they didn't get into too much trouble. And we had the Saturday rides, as I told you. I was on the Boy Scout football team where we played the smaller high schools. I was only about 150 pounds, and I played center, and that was a good weight for the kind of high schools we were playing. The big high schools like Leavenworth High School and Immaculata High School, the kids were just too big. But we had a ball playing these smaller high schools, had a pretty good record too. And in those days you went both ways. And in those days you didn't come out of a game, because if you did, you couldn't get back in during that quarter. If you'll let me clear my throat. Leavenworth was another dream place to be. Growing up in the old Army, had our own hospital. We did not have schools. We went down to the Leavenworth schools, which again, you mixed with the Leavenworth gang and got to learn a great deal about civilian life, but mostly through our classmates, that type thing. Wonderful place to be. Senior year of high school, moved to Philadelphia, where I went to Frankfort High School in Philadelphia. Frankfort Arsenal was a relatively small arsenal which produced small arms ammunition, cartridge cases for artillery, things like that. I got my first job there. I worked in the laboratory preparing specimens, for the most part, for the laboratory to test of the ammunition produced by the production lines of the arsenal. Very, very interesting work, and very, very helpful as I grew into an ordnance officer, which is what I was headed for being. But that graduated from Frankfort High School, and I didn't mention it. I looked at the Frankfort High School football team thinking I might go out for center on that team, and the starting center was named Komisik. He was a 235-pound Polish extraction, and I said, I'm not going to sit there opposite him or waiting for him to get hurt and me to play football. The second string center was about a 220-pound Lithuanian. I don't remember his name. And I said, no high school football for me, believe me. From there, I went to West Point and did my 4 years at West Point. Did very well, graduated in the top 10% of the class. I really did better than that, but my plebe year, I was like 140 or 50 in the class, of at about 500. But I worked my way up. I was probably, well, I was 54 overall in my class, but that includes that you never lost a grade. Those plebe grades held me back, so I ended up at 54, but I was probably around in the top 30, top 25 of the class. Military-wise, I was a cadet captain, a regimental supply officer, and which was a very nice position to be because the gold chevron stretched from the tip of the shoulder all the way down to the bend of the elbow. So I had the biggest chevrons of anybody. Even though the people above me had 6 chevrons, they didn't have those 4 bars below that were really looked good for the girls. But from there, I went to the engineer school, and then, as I told you, to the Engineer Replacement Training Center.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand you went with some. You went to West Point. You attended West Point with some pretty recognizable gentlemen.
Oh, in a sense. By the time I was an upperclassman, one of the plebe classes in my company, and the company only had about 100, 120 men, but in my company I had Johnny Eisenhower, Georgie Patton, and Mark Clark. In the next company, B company, we had Hap Arnold's son, and both of the Clay brothers, Lucius and Frank Clay, 4-star fathers. And there may have been a couple more whose names I just don't remember right now. But I became very familiar with Johnny Eisenhower and with Georgie Patton. Mark Clark was very, very withdrawn, and I didn't get to know him very well. And there's no reason for me to, because I was a first-classman, and he was a plebe, maybe a yearling by the time I was a first-classman. But he was quite withdrawn. Eisenhower knew enough to stay in the background. Patton was always in trouble. So I got to know him. As far as Hap Arnold was concerned, I didn't know him very well, but the Clay brothers became among my best friends, even though they were a class ahead of me.
And what year did you graduate, West?
I graduated in 1943 on Lee's birthday, January 19th.
So this was a few years after Pearl Harbor had been attacked and
yes.
joined World War II.
I was a sophomore. I guess I was a junior when Pearl Harbor occurred. I'm trying to think. I was 40. I became a sophomore. June of 41, I was a junior, and I was in the movies. I don't remember what I was watching, but I had about 3 buddies with me, and as we came out of the movie into the bright light after that dark movie, one of my classmates came running up and said, "Hey fellas, the Japs have just bombed Pearl Harbor." This was a Sunday, and as I say, it has to be around 2, 3, maybe even as late as 4 o'clock. And we said, "Oh, go away, Scotty, stop pulling our legs." But he says, "No, this is the truth." So we all ran back to barracks, which was close to half a mile, and got our little BP-10 radios out and tuned them in. And sure enough, we got all the government messages that were put out on public radio about the fact that we were now at war. And we knew we were going to war. At first, we really didn't know which side we were going on. The German-American Bund was really a huge, huge program, and particularly in New York, and we were located in New York. So we got all the publicity that they got, and they were a powerful political force, and it was not at all clear which side we'd go in on. But by the time we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, it had already been pretty clear that Germany was the selected enemy. We did not expect Japan, we expected Germany. And yes, by the time we went to war, we all expected for sure that it would be Germany. And I remember during the Battle of Britain, we all gave speeches and talks when we had to prepare talks for English or something like that, or for history. It was very clear that almost the entire Corps of Cadets was on the side of going to war against Germany and with Britain, on the side of Britain. And of course we had our relationship with the French dating back to the Revolutionary War, which was even more of a reason to go in on the side of the French, the British.
So how did things change for you, if at all, after Pearl Harbor had been attacked?
Well, the first thing that happened was instead of going 4 years, they made it the equivalent of 3.5. And the result was that our law course was cut in half. We were supposed to have a year of law, and then they had to condense that course into 7 months or 6 months or something like that. And we had to skip quite a few courses. They had to just drop them to be able to compress other courses into that short time. So everything became accelerated. Everything now had a purpose. Every course that we had was to help us out really in our direct military involvement after we graduated. They'd never had it before, but we had courses on how do you fill out a morning report, how do you fill out a council book, which is the company fund, how do you fill out a guard roster, how do you fill out the sick book, things like that. All practical things that the kids in their 90 days of OCS learned very well, but West Point graduates went in blind, but they decided we better not go in blind because we'd be so far behind the OCS in practical officership that they began to give us that type thing. And our military training switched to such things as how do you right an overturned truck, how do you throw together a hasty bridge, hasty fortifications, how do you dig a foxhole. We began to get that type thing, very practical education. But academically, we stuck pretty well with academic subjects, but emphasizing those that would be of use after we graduated. In my case, engineering, slump tests for concrete, how do you make a trestle bridge, and things like that. It changed.
So you graduated in '43.
Yeah.
And then what came next for you after graduation?
Well, we went to a refresher course in engineering, military engineering, at Fort Belvoir. You asked what happened next. Went to Fort Belvoir, took a course in military engineering. They called it a West Point refresher. There wasn't a thing new on it. We relearned how to build bridges. We learned how to inflate pontoons. We learned how to do scouting and patrolling because engineers fought as infantry when required. And so everything we had were things that we had already had, and it was really not even a refresher course. It was just a repetition of what we already knew. If you want the truth, it was totally useless. But the training we had as platoon leaders across the street in the replacement training center, absolutely invaluable. The handling of men, the realization, in my case, I was very lucky. I had the entire St. Louis University football team had volunteered the same day, and therefore they were assigned to my platoon for their basic training. And it was enjoyable having such eager young types in the platoon as the bulk of the platoon, but I also had an old man who just didn't fit in. And I called him in and I said, tell me a little bit about yourself. And he gave me that he was born in, let's say, Lithuania, it doesn't matter, and that he was a Jew. And I said, well, you say you're a Lithuanian? He said, no, I'm not a Lithuanian. I was born there, but I am a Jew. And that was the first time I realized they considered themselves as a nation. I'd had Jewish playmates and been very good friends with many of them. But this was the first time I recognized that they were considerably more than a religion. They were a nation. And I asked his trade, and he said, I'm a tailor. And I said, well, let's see what I can do. I know that the Post Exchange is desperate for tailors. So I went up to the Post Exchange, got him transferred from my platoon to the local local Post Exchange, where he became the star tailor. And whenever my platoon had anything like patches or chevrons to sew on, you can bet your bottom boots they were out the same day, and they were beautifully done. But I learned an awful lot just by that one experience. And but the whole thing was really very, very useful. I really didn't learn about what an old grizzled infantryman or engineer would be like, but I did learn what a young drafty soldier was going to be like. And it was great experience. The 10th Armored, when I got down there, they were in a field exercise training camp. They called it Tiger Camp. And it had the usual obstacle courses and the infiltration course, which is live fire going off above you and you are in the mud. And, the live fire is to keep you down so that you're in the mud and that type thing, as well as training on all the engineer functions within the battalion or within the company in my case. How you inflated a pontoon and how you put in the foundation for a pontoon bridge, a rubber pontoon bridge, things like that. We worked on all of those things. Very, very useful, very, very important training. And from that we went on to the Tennessee maneuvers, where I suddenly I called it promoted to being the engineer reconnaissance platoon leader, where I had a complete engineer armored company, plus a reconnaissance section of 4 extra jeeps with non-coms in them and drivers. And I told you about how that made me very popular among the younger officers. So from there, Tennessee maneuvers, I had to work like a dog because I was doing the work of a squadron, a cavalry squadron. Not well, because with 50 men I couldn't do the work of 500, but believe it or not, I had some rather super experiences that taught me many, many lessons. In between the phases of the maneuvers, everybody got to go to Knoxville or something like that, but little old John, the engineer reconnaissance officer, had to go out and reconnoiter every bridge that would be used in the next phase, all the roads, to see whether they would bear tanks or what the highest vehicle was they could carry. And in that process, I developed a new bridge card, which works much better than the standard bridge card. And I could reconnoiter a bridge in quarter the time of anybody else. So although I worked hard, I didn't have to waste my time computing the load carrying ability of each individual steel or wooden girder in that bridge, that type thing. Was very, very useful experience. But while I was there, I learned a very, very valuable lesson. And that was, I was not cut out to be an armored officer. I was cut out to be an infantry officer. All of my training, when I was a kid, the books that I read were mapping, scouting and patrolling, infantry tactics, things like that. And when you came against an enemy position, you held him by fire, dismounted a few, and sent him around to envelop and attack the enemy from the back. In the armor, what you do when you meet an enemy position is you go into high gear, overdrive if you have it, and you step on the accelerator as hard as you can, and you start firing all your weapons, whether they are targets or not, and you just burst through the enemy position, and then you reassemble on the far side. Maybe you will come back and attack them from the rear, but that just wasn't my nature. I'd been taught that find them, fix them, envelop them, defeat them.
More tactical approach.
Yeah. So they announced that they were forming a new Ranger Battalion, and I said, that will be right up my alley, but I was an engineer officer. How am I going to get into an infantry battalion? Well, I went down and I sold myself as I'd been taught. I knew how to lay minefields, knew how to map minefields, I knew how to lay wire, knew how to map wire, I knew how to dig field fortifications, I knew basic carpentry and things like this. And the battalion commander says, I need somebody like you to train the troops on these elements that are so important to attacking forces. So I got in to be the engineer officer of an infantry battalion and to train other people how to handle demolitions and how to disarm minefields and things like that. Never did one thing. They made me a platoon leader the instant I got there, and I was back in the infantry.
If I can ask you, and please forgive my ignorance, but when you attended West Point,
Yeah.
You're not in the Army necessarily.
Yes, you are.
You are. Okay.
You are subject to the Articles of War. Okay. You are uniformed. You obey the Articles of War. We, of course, obeyed cadet regulations, but every Army regulation that could be applied to our actions was applied to our actions. We were in the Army. After we went to war, we, instead of having a cadet patrol the barracks area about once a night, we actually took all the plebes, armed them with caliber 45 pistols, and we would have a guard of the barracks, probably about 50 plebes a night, and they would patrol the halls and the area outside the barracks so that nobody could get in. And in that sense, they were acting as active duty troops. They had authority to shoot and a few things like that. It was touchy, touch and go, but yes, we were in the Army as far as that's concerned.
So once you graduate West Point, is there a re-enlistment that occurs, or are you?
Well, no, what happens when you're a cadet, you have a warrant, which is a piece of paper that informs you that you will be subject to the authority of so-and-so and so-and-so, that type thing. And it includes the Articles of War, as we used to call them. Today it's the Code of Military Conduct, but then it was the Articles of War. And that's about it for a cadet. You're not commissioned. You're not enlisted. You fit right technically where the warrant officer in the military sits. You're neither commissioned nor enlisted, but you have a position of relative importance, and you're given this thing called a warrant, which is nothing more than a license. When you graduate, you're given a commission, and that commission is the thing that guides you for the rest of your career. When you retire, you lose your commission, and things like that. When you're dismissed, you lose your commission, and that's a big thing. The commission is a big, big thing. Did that answer your question?
Yes, yes, thank you. So you were talking about how how you wanted to be an infantry leader rather than
Yeah.
engineer.
Well, there was a lot more than that to it. When my mother was growing up in Fort Smith, Arkansas, there was a little nasty boy down the street named Bill Darby, who used to pull the older girls' hair and act like the usual teenage imp. And Bill Darby grew up to be a cadet, an officer, and established the 1st Ranger Battalion in Ireland, and moved it to Scotland and got them trained by the commandos. They participated in the Dieppe raid, some of them did, and they also led the invasion of Africa. And I knew of Bill Darby. I had met him because he became a plebe while my father was still stationed at West Point, and I know he is one of the cadets who came over because I heard about Bill Darby all my life. So I wanted to get into the Rangers, particularly Life magazine had some beautiful spreads with Darby featured in them and the Rangers featured. And I said, I got to get into Darby's Rangers. Well, I didn't make Darby's Rangers, I made Rudder's Rangers. And so that was the additional story that made me volunteer for that Ranger Battalion.
And once you were accepted into the Ranger Battalion,
yeah,
what came next for you?
Well, I stayed as a platoon leader for a month, maybe 2 months. I don't remember. I could find it in my record somewhere. But one of the staff officers, young staff officers, was having problems. He just wasn't suitable for doing staff work. He didn't know what an op order was. He didn't know what an estimate of the situation was. He didn't know that staff officers are absolute nothings. They are nothing but brains who assist with their mouths the commander in making decisions. He just didn't have the right attitude. So they pulled him out, made him a platoon leader, and he was a distinguished platoon leader. I mean, it was his stuff. He'd been a paratrooper, but he was one of those unfortunate people that as soon as he jumped out of the plane, every time he jumped out, he passed out and didn't wake up until he was maybe 50 feet off the ground. Sometimes he was still unconscious when he hit the ground. And he decided that, you know, I don't belong here. What if I had to pull my emergency chute? I just don't belong here. So he volunteered for the Rangers. And as I say, he was an excellent platoon leader, became a company commander before the battalion disbanded. And they put me in his job in the staff, which was battalion training officer. So I got to oversee the training aspects of the 5th Battalion. I didn't get to do the training myself, which is a thing that I hated. That's not true. I wouldn't have gone down that damn death slide for anything. But I didn't have to because I was assigning other people to go.
So I have to ask you, what is the death slide?
The death slide is where they take you to a river or a lake that's reasonably wide and reasonably deep. And on one side, they go up 90 feet and tie a cable. And to the other side, they put in a dead man and tie a cable to that. And then they make you climb the 90 foot of the tree, throw your toggle rope over it, and come down that death slide, which is at about a 45-degree angle. You get the speeds of 45 miles an hour, and you better let go and drop in the water, because if you hit the ground at that speed, you're going to the hospital. So you have to let go of the toggle rope at the right moment and drop into the water. I never did that. Never had to do that. So that was the death slide.
So you were instructing others in these.
Actually, what I was doing was scheduling. Okay. More than anything else, I was a scheduler and got my my orders from Captain Sullivan, who became Major Sullivan, who later took over the battalion as Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan. And he and I became very good friends. But I worked for him. He decided what had to be done, and for that he got it from the Corps Ranger Training Organization. And I then assigned the units to do the various things that were required in that phase of training. I really didn't do a damn thing original, but I learned a lot.
And where did all this take place?
Camp Forest, Tennessee.
Okay.
2 R's in Forest, Nathan Bedford Forest.
And what time of year is this?
We organized on September 1st of 1944. Our training began on September 11th. And we trained for the next, I think we moved to Florida in October, probably October, and trained at Fort Pierce, Florida, with the Navy and the Marines in amphibious operations down there.
Was this 1943 or
1944?
44. So this was after the D-Day invasion.
I said 43, 44. We started training in 43. We trained at Camp Forest until probably the middle of October. I could give you an exact date, but probably the middle of October. Moved to Camp Fort Pierce, trained with the Navy and Marines. This is all in 43. Okay. We then went to Fort Dix, beginning our staging for going overseas, and we still did an awful lot of training there, particularly on the ranges, rifle ranges and machine gun ranges and things like that. We did a lot of speed marching, a lot of physical training, because what passes for a civilian, even in those days, couldn't possibly stand up to a day of being a ranger. So we're constantly working on physical training, physical aspects, gaining endurance, gaining strength. And from there we went to Fort Kilmer, which was the port of embarkation. It was suburban New Brunswick, New Jersey. And we continued to do training there, but we didn't have the facilities to do much more than physical training, endurance training, and things like that. And everybody got a 3-day pass to go home while we were there and things like that. As for me, I was a company commander. I had the entire battalion mess. I had to go to cooks and bakers school, which I dearly hated. But I did learn about dehydrated food.
So the training for an Army Ranger is more extensive and involved than a regular infantry?
Oh, absolutely. We expect that our trained Ranger will be involved in combat from the moment the first shot is fired till the last one is fired. We expect that every shot he fires will be aimed. We expect that he will fire every shot expected of him. With a regular infantry squad, you will find people fire their rifles up into the air. They never get off the ground and move or do anything like that. 1 or 2 per squad will do what he should, but we expect every Ranger to do what he should, and to do it far better than an infantryman. He will be an expert on his rifle, as opposed to maybe being a marksman, and he's just a better trained soldier. We used to say that infantry training is grammar school, Ranger training is high school, Special Forces Green Beanie training is college, or Delta Forces college.
It's a good way of
putting it in. And it's just you are trained much, much better. And that training motivates you. You've been through it in training, therefore you're not shocked when it happens in combat. You just go about your business saying, oh, I expected that, bang.
So when did you guys disembark and arrive overseas, and where did you arrive overseas?
The date was January 19th that we pulled into the harbor. We disembarked, I believe it was Liverpool, on the 20th, and went by train immediately to Leominster, England, pronounced Leominster but spelled Leominster. And there we again resumed the same kind of training we'd been doing to make us tougher, give us better endurance, make us stronger, make us better. And we stayed in Leominster among those beautiful hedgerows from January up into, it has to be March. I'd always thought it was April, but it couldn't have been April because we couldn't have done what we did. So it had to be about March. We went to Scotland, where we went into the commando school, and they took over our training. And there we, for the first time, we really went into difficult live fire unit training. We suffered so many casualties, and were expected to, because it was live fire, that we had a mobile army surgical hospital, a MASH. We had a MASH attached to us with 2 surgeons, I think it was, not a full complement of 10 or 15. But they saved many a life, and we lost many a life in our training in Scotland. It was very, very realistic.
So the casualties that did occur, would they be considered accidents?
No, well, they would have been called training accidents.
Mm-hmm.
And
how would one?
Here's one training accident we had. A company was attacking a particular area, and was supported by its own 60mm mortars, and they were firing on the target. C Company, which we had made into an 81, or at least they had 81mm mortars, the medium mortar, observed this mortar fire falling and said, "We'll support it." So they fired a few 81s at the target. They did not know that the 60s had lifted and the infantry had assaulted and was in the area, and now 81mm mortars were falling all around them. We took quite a few casualties that day. I don't know how many were killed or anything, but that's the type thing that happened. But a great learning lesson was there, and that is, you do not fire on a target unless you have permission of the attacking infantry. So, big lesson learned, cost a couple of lives and a lot of injuries. So that's the type thing that happened. And ricochets and things like that from small arms, machine guns and rifles. Sooner or later, they're going to get somebody in the assaulting forces.
Understood. Yeah, I imagined you guys weren't using live fire against each other.
No, we didn't, but occasionally friendly fire.
Yeah, that makes sense. So this training went on for months leading up?
About a month, and then we went to the Assault Training Center at Broughton, where they had rigged up a training center that was devoted entirely to the attack of a hostile shore, how to defeat enemy positions, how to penetrate enemy wire, how to knock out a turret, a machine gun turret, how to work a flamethrower to chase people out of turrets and things like that. Involved actually being in landing craft assault or landing craft, coming out of the landing craft, what does each person of the team on that landing craft do immediately, and things like that.
So is this more or less preparing you for the invasion of
Preparing us
France?
for the invasion. Every assault unit that was going to land on a hostile beach, to including the follow-ups and people like that, had to go through the assault training center. No exceptions. Everybody had to go through them. I was out picking up supplies and things like that and never got to go into it on a single exercise. Again, it was just like back in Camp Forest when I was training officer. I didn't get to do it. From there, we went to Swanage, England, and engaged in cliff training. I missed it because just before Swanage we went to the Fabius II exercise, which was a multi-divisional exercise where we landed behind 29th Division elements and things like that. While loading the troops out, now Major Sullivan had gotten a terrible chill being stupid, and he wasn't wearing a field jacket, and big old John, the Norwegian hero, I gave him my field jacket, and in the process came down with pneumonia that night. So I spent the whole cliff climbing exercise in the hospital with beautiful clean sheets, gorgeous American nurses. It was wonderful. But I got back in time to engage in the cleanup of a few speed marches, but didn't get to do any cliff climbing. But having been a kid in Boston and climbed cliffs where the fire department had to rescue me a couple of times, I knew how to climb a cliff.
Now, did you guys know what this training would be applied for in the
country? Oh, absolutely, we knew. We didn't know where. The last week or two before we embarked, they gave us maps of where we would land with all the known German positions on them, but every word had been removed from the map. The maps were there, the terrain features were there, the trenches were there, the minefields were there, the buildings were there, the woods were, everything was on those maps except words. And we knew exactly what our mission was, where we were to land on those maps. They even had sand tables, but no names. And so we got to look at them on sand tables. They had aerial photos. Again, no words. And we got to look at the whole thing, and for 2 or 3 weeks solid, we studied the maps, the photos, the sand tables. And we knew everything about the whole area, what our mission was, that type thing. Once we got on the boats on June 1st, on June 1st we loaded onto the transports, and they took away all of our nameless maps and gave us maps with the real names on them, and there is one of them right there. That's in black and white. That's a facsimile. They were 4-colored maps, beautiful maps. Now we had names on them, and but we never got off the boats or the ships, so it was safe. And we put names on the places, and some of the names were wrong. They called it Pointe du Hoc. It wasn't Ho, it was Ock. And the Ormond farm was really something else, and things like that. But we memorized those maps, and when I was on the beach, I looked around and I saw a wooden seawall, and I said, my God, this isn't our beach. Our seawall was cement. Where is a wooden seawall? I'd studied the maps. I knew where the wooden seawall was. I said, we are way, way east of where we're supposed to be. We're up at Les Moulins. And I remember one of my sergeants saying, Captain, do you know where we are? And I said, sure, I know where we are. Do you know the way to the rallying point? Yes, I know the way to the rallying point. I knew where we were.
Those weeks of preparation.
Weeks of preparation.
So can you talk to me about the the days leading up to the invasion? I know that the initial invasion was delayed a day
Yeah.
due to weather.
We were in a marshalling area, a camp, with the 2nd Ranger Battalions in the same big camp. We were in different areas of it, and occasionally we visited one another for training. We were already confined to camp, but the training went on. For instance, we joined them and got to climb the ladders. They brought 2 DUKWs up, running up their 120-foot ladders, having them crossed. Well, what people don't know is even on concrete tarmac, those ladders are going like this. 4 feet, 6 feet, 6 inches, 4 feet, 6 feet apart. We all in combat equipment, every man, including me, this time I couldn't get out of it, had to climb that ladder, and approximately 100 feet above the ground, we had to transfer from this ladder to that ladder. And that meant you're on this ladder and they may be going this way, but sooner or later they're going this way, and when they're going that way and get close enough, you're going to have to transfer from one ladder to the other, knowing that if you miss it, you have a 100-foot fall. And right behind you is another man waiting to do the same thing. And we did that with the 2nd Battalion. And I'll guarantee you, I got acrophobia, and believe me, that is the worst thing I ever had to do in my life. But I did it. So that's what we were doing in the days working up to loading on the ships.
So you got on the ships June 1st.
On the ships June 1st.
And are you stayed in port, or are you guys in the channel?
Oh, we stayed in port. I was in Portland. The 5th Battalion, we were in Portland Harbor. The 2nd Battalion was in Weymouth Harbor. They really were one harbor separated by a boom. And in peacetime, the boom wouldn't be there. But in wartime, it was part of the anti-submarine, anti-torpedo boat attack defense system. So we stayed in the harbor, and continued our training. Here again, physical exercise to stay in shape, not get out of shape while we're just sitting there rocking on the thing. Studying the maps with names on them, the sand tables with names on them, the aerial photos with names on them. At night, the captains of the ships were very nice. They would allow us to take one of the landing craft and go visit other ships to talk to the other people, because the 5th Rangers were on 2 ships, and we could go visit the people on the other ships. And they allowed the officers, many of the senior non-coms, to do the same thing. And I didn't do that, but it was very nice. You got to say goodbye to a few of your best friends and things like that. And there was one man, one officer, everybody in the battalion knew he was going to die. He was the Boy Scout of the battalion, a Mormon, superb officer. We knew he would, he'd kill himself by his devotion to duty. And he did. Bang, right through the head. But everybody wanted to visit him. And as I say, I guess that was to keep our morale up. The chaplain in particular would go from ship to ship during the day. He'd hold Mass every day in both ships, plus not just Mass. He would also hold Protestant services, and he'd hold Jewish services. And he was down there with the men the whole time. And he'd go over to not just to the 5th Ranger boats, but they would take him over to the, I think the 2nd Rangers had 4 boats, or 4 ships, and he'd go and do the same thing for them.
So can you talk to me about, I guess it would be June 5th, or would it be the night of the 4th, leading into the morning of the 5th, when the initial invasion was supposed to take place?
About 4:30, we received word that the invasion was to be on the morning of the 5th. Up anchor, maneuver out of the harbor, down to the eye of the Needle, often called the race course, I think. I don't think we ever got to the eye of the Needle when they called it off. We turned around, retraced ourselves back probably to the exact same anchorage, and waited the next day until about 4:30. They said, "This is it, and there's no turning back this time." So we then went in. By the time we were really out in the channel, it was pretty dark. It was pretty dark. And of course the channel is, because of the curvature of the earth, the channel was way out of sight of the German observation. But reconnaissance airplanes and patrol boats could have seen us. So we really didn't get anywhere near where we could be seen while it was still daylight.
And delaying any further would have only potentially compromised.
Yeah, we couldn't do it again. I think there was one more day in the window, but you couldn't marshal that fleet twice. You just couldn't do it. And the weather was predicted to be more horrible on the 3rd possible day. So, no, this was the last chance. It had to be this particular day. And the sea was rough.
Did you get any sleep the night before?
Oh, none. No, I served 3 watches aboard the Prince Baudouin. The reason I did was the man who relieved me was Captain Bill Wise, and I felt he could use the sleep. And then the next man to relieve me was Major Sullivan, and I thought he could use the sleep, except I knew he was out prowling. I knew he was going around looking at the men, making sure that nothing bad was going on and that everybody's gear was ready and things like that. But I did 3 watches, midnight to 2, 2 to 4, and 4 to 6, except we dropped anchor somewhere around 3:30. So I guess it was 10 to 12, 12 to 2, and 2 to 4. We dropped anchor somewhere around 3:30, and I remember the very welcome words, "Captain, you're no longer needed on the bridge." So I went down, and I don't remember if I caught any sleep or not. I think I didn't sleep at all. I just checked equipment 10 more times.
So you were headquarters company commander?
Headquarters company commander, which carried also the title of headquarters commandant. My duties really were those of a headquarters commandant. And he is the guy that gets the staff sections, the enlisted men of the staff sections, to the staff officers. Also, I had a communications platoon, and again, supplied communications to the staff offices, but also established other communications, like down to the companies by wire and things like that. Plus, I had the radios that would communicate with the companies from the headquarters by radio. And I also had the supply section, and the supply section was the one that brought in all the rations, brought in all the ammunition. So in real sense, I would just turn over all of my men to staff officers who were the ones that directed their activities. I had to lay out the headquarters. Where's the parking area? Where's the mess tent? Where is the operations? Where is G2? Where is the message center? All of those things are part of a headquarters commandant's job. But you didn't do that in the invasion, so I knew I would not be particularly busy doing that part of my job. Furnishing the people of the staff sections, yes. We did that as soon as we got ashore.
But other things had to happen before.
Yeah, but there was no thought that we'd set up a headquarters.
So getting off the ship, you guys took LCAs into the
Yes,
beach?
we took British LCAs, the commando assault craft, much better than the Higgins boats, except for one little feature where the Higgins boat was superior. The ramp of the LCA was the end of a fairly long passage, and the passageway was certainly no more than 2 feet. The coxswain was on your right, and theoretically the boat commander was on your left, and you went down a passageway between them. And the ramp itself was probably no more than 3 feet, conceivably 4 feet, when you dropped it. That meant that you had to go single file with full pack, full equipment, and it took about 2 to 5 minutes to unload an LCA. Whereas on the, we were lower in the water, we had more powerful engines, we had armor plate on part of the hull. All in all, it was just a good vessel. The Higgins boat was just nothing but a big piece of plywood attached to another piece of plywood with metal fittings and things like that, and a great big ramp that had to be at least 10 feet because you had to be able to use a Jeep. You'd drive a Jeep or a 3/4 ton out of it. And so when they dropped that ramp, the 34 troops that were aboard could be off the damned Higgins boat, LCPR, could be off the LCPR in a matter of 30 seconds, whereas it took us sometimes, it might be 3-4 minutes of banging your pack from side to side. Somebody trips and falls, now he's got to get up, and it took a long time.
So if you could take me through loading the LCAs and your approach into the beach, where you guys landed.
Yeah, the LCA again was very nice. It had benches. It had 3 benches, 2 down the side and 1 down the center. And the people on the center bench straddled it and were facing forward. Now, your knees, if you're on the center bench, were interfering with the knees of the guys on the side, but it was workable. It was workable. Now, let's see, what else is there about? Oh yes, the people sitting in the LCAs had overhead cover because the officer in charge very often had to run down this overhead cover to get back to where the engineer was and where the signalman was. He was usually up front with the coxswain.
Because there's nowhere to maneuver in
But
the
this overhead cover was actually a passageway for him. It was also the way we got air, which is fortunate. But it was nice, we could sit down, and but it was very, very slow unloading. The Higgins boat had no seats. Everybody had to stand up the whole way, but the smart boat commander would say, okay, half you guys lie down, and the other half stand up. So the other half would stand up and lean against the sides of the LCPR. And as I say, they were just nothing but plywood. A bullet would go through them and not even know that it had passed through plywood. Whereas with us, it had to go through armor and then plywood and then bodies. It was much, much better.
So where were you guys supposed to land?
We were supposed to land at Pointe du Hoc behind the, and I say Hawk, people keep correcting me, that particular case the French used the H, Hawk, Fort Pointe du Hawk. We were supposed to land behind the 2nd Ranger Battalion. Their ropes, their ladders, their toggle rope ladders, all of those things were supposed to still be in position, so we could use those to assist us in getting up the cliffs. We would be 3 waves, 2 companies in the 1st wave, 3 companies in the 2nd wave, 3 companies in the 3rd wave.
You're speaking of the 5th Ranger.
Yeah. So really, we didn't train on that. I know that in the cliff training they trained on it, but I never knew what particular rope I was supposed to go up, and I'm not sure anybody else did. I think it was you find a rope and you go up, and that was the plan. We didn't conceive that the 2nd Rangers, if they got up the cliffs, that they'd have any trouble destroying the guns. That was just almost a given, that the guns would be destroyed, period. There were enough thermite grenades. All you have to do is to throw a thermite grenade down the muzzle or into the elevating mechanism or into the traversing mechanism, and you have disabled the gun. It is absolutely useless, and that wasn't any problem. But if we got up there, the 2nd Rangers were almost sure to have enough force to do that. So what our mission was going to be was to go out and establish a battalion roadblock on the main coastal road to prevent reinforcements from counterattacking Omaha Beach. The 2nd Rangers had that mission, but they would only have probably 100 men left to do it, whereas we would have 500. And that would give us a total of 600 doing the mission. And I'm quite sure that Rudder had it in mind that he would use the 2nd Battalion in reserve and get them to reorganize while we were out there in the blocking positions. I think that Rudder probably would have been prepared to move 1 or 2, maybe 3 of our companies down the road through Grand Camp, because the actual division mission, 29th Division mission, was Isigny beyond Grand Camp. And so Rudder might have furthered that mission, and I'm quite sure that he was well aware of it, and it had been discussed, and he knew precisely what to do. But we didn't know what to do after we set up the roadblock positions.
So the boat that you landed in, which wave did you come in?
3rd wave.
Okay.
Yeah.
And which beach did you land on?
Well, actually, let me go through it. We lay off between Pointe du Hawk and Pointe de la Percée and circled for about 30 minutes. Our orders were at 7 o'clock, which was H+30, that if we had not gotten a success signal from the 2nd Battalion, we were to divert to Vierville Beach. 7 o'clock rolled by, both the British commander afloat, and he owned us. The British commander afloat commanded us until we touched ground with our feet. As soon as we touched ground with our feet, 29th Division commanded us. But in any event, we circled and circled, and finally at 10 after 7, the British commander said, divert to Vierville. All the books, including mine, say Major Schneider gave up and said, we just got to do it. Well, we had been discussing it, and so he had as much to do. He was probably discussing it with the captain of the Prince Charles the whole time, just as we were discussing it. And in any event, the captain of the Prince Charles gave the command, and we then proceeded toward Vierville. So we'd been waved off now from Pointe du Hawk. As we were coming in, about 1,000 yards out off the beach were landing control boats. They were motorboats, heavy on signals. They knew what was going on, and as we approached them, those boats said, "Dog Green is closed. Land on White Beach." So we had our orders. We've been waved off twice now. We went in on White Beach, but actually we went in on the exact boundary between Green Beach and White Beach, so that B Company of the 2nd was actually on Green Beach, and A Company of the 2nd was actually on White Beach. The headquarters boat was actually on White Beach as well. They were decimated. Enemy fire from the trenches on the crests, the artillery fire from Pointe du Hoc, which was only 800 yards away, was devastating. The WN-70, they landed right below WN-70, and WN-70 didn't have anything else to do, so they fired on them too, and they were devastated. They lost A Company lost all its officers immediately. B Company, Captain Arnold survived, and perhaps a lieutenant, I don't know. A couple of the headquarters officers survived on White Beach. Well, we were about 1,000 yards, at least Colonel Schneider was about 1,000 yards out, but he had good field glasses, and he saw what happened, and he was correct. He said, "I'm not going to lose my battalion on that beach." So he turned to the British commander and negotiated with him to go down until they found a suitable beach, which was 800 more meters, really. And he turned right into the beach, probably from about 1,000 yards out, and worked his way through the obstacles and landed on Dog White. The third wave, we were really the third wave, came in about 50 yards offset from them over the same 200 yards. So we had a 250-yard front. And my boat and perhaps one boat from Company C landed on Dog White, while the rest of them landed on Dog Red. I probably said Dog White earlier, but the rest of them all landed on Dog Red. We immediately, company commanders went to locate the battalion commander. I was told by Major Sullivan to remain with the right flank and organize them in the event of a counterattack. And Sullivan took my place at the company commanders meeting. He came back and said the orders are for you to move to D Dog Company position, follow C Company machine gun section, go through the hole that will be blown, and follow the troops. And those were my orders.
And do you know about what time you landed?
I landed at precisely 7:50. I looked at it and looked at my watch, and it's in Omaha Beachhead as well, because I told Lieutenant Colonel Taylor, I looked at my watch the instant my foot hit the ground, and it was 07:50.
And can you talk about the sights and sounds as you're approaching the beach, and then?
Oh yeah, the first thing that was noticeable when we turned and went into the beach, the first thing that was noticeable, an LCM was hit by artillery fire. We heard it happen. We saw it in flames. It was perhaps 200-300 yards from us. We hadn't reached the obstacles yet, but that was our introduction. Then the noise from the shoreline began to gradually increase, and the noise from the shoreline contained at least one 20-millimeter cannon that we could hear firing in Ehrlichen. And gradually the small arms fire was heard. But long before that, we could hear the artillery rounds crunching into the larger landing craft. So the noise was increasing. And I would say that when we were perhaps 500 yards out, it was already close to deafening. But it may have been 300 yards out that it was close to deafening. By then we were maneuvering through the obstacles, and I remember distinctly I was up and I saw it bearing down on a teller mine on an obstacle. And I said to myself, this is it. And I thought it was it. But a wave caught us, carried us away, and we missed that teller mine. There wasn't anything else exciting as the coxswain maneuvered through obstacles. He grounded. The ramp went down. I was second off. Major Sullivan was first. I was second. He went left, so I went right. That's doctrine. The water was no more than 8 inches deep. It did not go over the top of my boots. So I considered it a dry landing. I'd never heard of a dry landing before, but I ran to the right. There was about 50 yards of beach, maybe 40. Halfway up the beach, there was a runnel full of tidal water. And as I reached the tidal water, I saw machine gun bullets hitting in it. And I said to myself, they're trained just like we are. Hold the trigger for 3 to 5 bullets, let up, cool the barrel, pull it again. So I went in while the bullets were splashing. My runner right behind me, he stopped, waited until the bullets stopped splashing, ran, got caught by the next burst. He was my only casualty. So I got 34-ish people aboard, 35, on the beach with but one casualty. And he was not, he got a shot in the thigh and was evacuated.
He survived?
Oh yeah, he survived.
And were you guys the first to hit that particular beach?
No. No, at least 3 waves, maybe more, of infantry had landed, mostly from Higgins boats. And
were there a lot of other casualties on the beach?
Oh, there were dead men all over the place. There were dying men all over the place. There were wounded men all over the place. There were screams for mama, screams for medic. And the tide was advancing at the rate of about 1 yard a minute. So there were 40 yards, that's 40 minutes the water would be in the breakwaters. As it happened, I got to the edge of the breakwaters. I couldn't get to the seawall. There were men piled up like logs against the seawall, 2 and 3 deep. So you couldn't even see the bottom 2 feet, 3 feet of the seawall. So we stopped inside the breakwaters or retards. They were 4-foot piles of stone, and I'm not talking little stone, I'm talking big stone, like 1 foot in diameter, 8 inches in diameter. And they were every 25 yards. They were about 25 yards long. They were about 4 feet high, and they extended back to the seawall. So where I came in, there were 2 of these retards in good repair, one on my right and one on my left, and just like little forts, little 4-foot stone forts. And we were perfectly safe once we got into the retard area.
And how much ground did you have to cover?
About 40 yards before we reached the retards. And by the time we left, the water had come up to maybe 20 yards from the retards.
And aside from the machine gun fire that you guys are taking on, are there shells hitting that particular part of the beach?
Yes,
as well?
quite a few. We came in between LCA 91 and 92, I think were the 2 numbers. It could have been 90 and 91. It's in my book. 91 hit first. We hit probably 30 seconds later, and 92 hit probably another 30 seconds to a minute later. So the three of us came in almost simultaneously. I did not see it, but 91, the one on my right, was hit by artillery shell fire from the Vierville exit or from the Pointe de la Percée batteries, artillery fire. It was on fire, at least the forward section was on fire shortly after we landed. 92 was hit by shell fire. Well, let me just say this. As I started to look around, I was looking at 92 and actually saw the shell hit a flamethrower tank of a man on the starboard gangway. And you've never seen anything like a jelly gasoline fire on a landing craft. It just spread all over like magic. And everybody that got off, and strangely enough, most of them did get off, they went over the sides or down the second ramp. But the second ramp was probably on fire also, but if you were brave, you could run through it and get to the ramp and go down. That was a horrible sight, seeing that flamethrower hit. I continued to look back. There was no point in looking at that. I continued to look back, and there was Father Lacey, the chaplain, coming off my LCA. And he didn't come and join us up there in the safety of the retards. He walked along the waterline and started pulling men ahead of the tide and saying last rites over the dead and things like that. He didn't join us for 6-8 hours.
So he had no regard for his own.
No regard for his own life. He was quite a hero. While I was watching him, shell hit the fantail of my LCA, and I looked away because I said, that's the end of LCA, what is it, 1733 or 37.3.8.11. I think it's 1733. But in any event, I said, that's the end of it, and I began to look at other things for then. What is the tactical situation and things like that.
So I imagine before hitting the beach, you must have had some sort of inclination of the defenses that were in place and what you guys would be up against.
Oh, yes.
How would you say what you actually experienced compared to what you had anticipated?
Well, we could hear the small arms. Now, small arms, when it goes a mile or less, it's still supersonic. So you hear the crack of the bullet as it passes by. You don't hear the shot. You hear the crack of the bullet. And every single bullet that passes over leaves a shock wave. And we were seeing 1,000 bullets, not a second, I don't think that much. But we were seeing an unbelievable amount of small arms coming in from our right, from the crests, and probably the artillery was all coming from Vierville and Pointe de la Percée. But the small arms was coming from the crests all the way up to maybe 200, 300 yards away from us. So we were hearing all those bullets crack by us. There probably were 50 MG 42s, and I think the other one was a 36 or something like that. They all had a cyclic rate that was twice the cyclic rate of our machine guns. And we just had thousands of those bullets passing us every second. And it was bad. I'm telling you, it was bad. It almost drowned out the cries of people and the wounded and the dying and things like that. I don't think that we expected it would be as bad when we got under that swarm of small arms bullets as it actually was. And of course, the bullets were hitting into the retards, and every time they did that, there was another kind of sound where it splattered out and moved the retard, some of the rock even. But no, it was noisy. It was unpleasant. There were vehicles on the beach that had been brought in by LCPRs, and most of them were burning, and soldiers' clothing was burning. The smells were unbelievable. People were already dead. Their bowels had been blown apart. The smells were awful. The noise was awful. The sight was awful. But it was not raining, and there was no fog down there. But up above on the hill, right above us, there was a lot of smoke from a brush fire. We could even see some flames. And that was one of our godsends. The retards were a godsend. The brush fire was a godsend because the Germans could not see us. The ones that were supposed to shoot at us couldn't. It was only the ones down to our right that could shoot at us. The ones on the left, they were around the nose. They couldn't shoot at us.
Do you, so I was going to ask you, how do you explain that your boat only took on one casualty? Do you attribute it to that smoke?
Oh yes,
fire
absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. It had won. The flames had chased Germans out of their positions. Who would want to be there with a bunch of explosives, high explosives, and a bunch of small arms, low explosives? They abandoned their machine guns and their crew-served weapons, and they fled. Others took their rifles with them and maybe a little bit of ammunition, and a few of them stayed because the flames had not threatened them directly, but the majority of them fled. So we went up without enemy fire directly in front of us. And the little bit that we saw them before they saw us. And in that sense, going up the hill was easy. It was steep, but the small arms fire held to the beach. And the bluffs were close to 100 yards in, 60 to 100 yards in. There was a little bit of small arms fire in that flat area leading to the bluffs, but not enough to worry anybody. Most of the small arms fire was on the beach. So once we got off the beach, we moved fairly freely.
So before you guys advanced off the beach, were you guys, was your company pretty well organized and together?
Yes.
At that point? You guys
Yeah.
been given,
Yeah. I had some good non-coms, and each of them counted the men in their section, and they knew where the non-com was, and when he moved out, he said, "Follow me," and they followed him. No, my people stayed together. Going through the smoke, two of the combat platoons that went through the smoke, the officers both said, "I had a whole platoon behind me when I went through that damn smoke, and when I came out, I had one." Everybody else had gone off in different directions, put on their gas mask, things like that. So here is the guy who was leading the way, was not leading the way, he was alone. And they found it very embarrassing.
And did your unit go through that smoke as well?
Yeah, we went through the smoke. I finally gave in and called for gas masks. The troops had been asking for it for about 2 minutes, and I finally gave in, pulled out my gas mask. Out fell the orange, the apple, the maps, the orders, tumbling downhill, put the gas mask on. Nothing happened. I'd forgotten to pull the plug. I ripped the mask off, breathed some more smoke, pulled off the plug, put the mask on. Helmet fell from between my knees with all that stuff, rolled down the hill. One of my sergeants caught it as it went by. He didn't catch the apples or the orange, at least he wouldn't admit it. And brought my helmet back to me. This time it worked. Took 3 steps and I was out of the smoke. I was so furious I wore my gas mask for 50 more yards.
What was the initial apprehension to not call for gas masks?
They all hated me for it. But I said, we'll get out of it. We'll get out of
You
it.
thought you were close to the...
No, I didn't. You couldn't see.
Okay.
But I said, we'll get out of it. But we didn't. And then we did.
So it was pretty tough to breathe.
It was very difficult to breathe. The brush from the storm probably was wettish, and that creates a great deal of smoke because there's steam involved and all of that kind of stuff. And it makes the burning last longer and the smoke generation take longer. It was tough stuff to get through. We had originally thought, when we saw it coming in, we thought that maybe the Navy had ignited it with white phosphorus. Conceivable. But I think that just plain high explosive naval gunfire was adequate to start the fires.
So just going back a little bit, how long, you said you had about 50 yards of beach to
Yeah.
cover before you got to the seawall. How long were you down there before you guys made your advance?
No more than 10 minutes, 15 minutes, probably closer to 5. It took a little time. Once the battalion commander gave the word called tally-ho, which meant proceed to the assembly area by platoon infiltration. So each platoon leader knew he was on his own. Once he said that, the C Company had to set up their 481 millimeter mortars on the beach to support the advance up the hill if necessary, or to place fire beyond the hill if necessary. The wire had to be blown, and that took a little bit of time too. You had to assemble the Bangalore torpedoes. Most of them were half assembled by then anyway. And then you had to push them out across the road, and then you didn't have enough Bangalore torpedo to push them under the wire, so the torpedo men had to jump up the seawall, grab the torpedo, run across the road pushing the torpedo under the wire. As soon as they got it under the wire, they pulled the fuse lighter, ran back, dropped down behind the seawall, and bang, the torpedo went. You had about 3 seconds on, or maybe 5 seconds on a fuse lighter. I've forgotten which it was. Probably 5. A hand grenade you had 3 seconds, but I think a fuse lighter you had 5.
And did you guys encounter any minefields?
No, because the flames had detonated most of the anti-personnel mines, and there were no vehicular or big mines up the mountain. We went through many a marked minefield where there was not a single mine. He was able to mine perhaps 1 out of 10 fields, but he had Achtung, minen signs on every field.
Just to put it in your...
Yeah, well, you had to go single file when you saw that. Walk in the steps of the man that made it.
So after you got off the beach and up the cliff, what came next?
Well, the bocage came, the hedgerows, and the farm fields, they came. And it was very difficult. We had thought, when we saw the hedgerows on our aerial photos, that they were like English hedges, beautifully manicured, clean underneath, all the weeds taken out and things like that. No. A hedgerow was a pile of rocks that was put there through the centuries by farmers to mark when they cleared rocks out of their fields, they put them on the border, and to mark the edge of their fields and to clear the fields for farming. In addition to that, birds carried seeds, and shrubbery grew up in those rocks, and there was also spoil from plowing in the rocks, so there was soil there. There were seeds. Over the centuries, the seeds sprouted into little trees in many cases, always little shrubs at least. impenetrable because they weren't cared for or anything like that. There were gaps in the hedgerows for the farmers to go from field to field. And you had to have at least two on every field. Now these fields were not little fields like this room. These fields were 300 by 700 yards and things like that. And the crops that they had in them, for the most part, they had not had any harvest yet because it was June, it wasn't September. And so they had these grasses that grew up to perhaps 3 feet. So if you were out in the middle of a hedgerow and a machine gun opened up on you, you could drop to the ground if you weren't shot to the ground. You could drop to the ground and move around and the Germans would have no idea where you were. People maintain that the bocage fighting was terrible, but in that sense, you could move right up to where the Germans had cut into the hedgerows, made little caves, and just the machine guns sticking out of them. You could get right up to them, and they couldn't see you because you were working 3 feet down in the crop. And usually what happened was you got caught in the hedgerow, the platoon leader would use infantry tactics. He'd say, okay, Joe, Bill, get over to the far hedgerow there, cross it, and come down the far side and hit this guy from the rear. We'll move up toward him. And so you have your infantry moving toward the machine gun and the small patrol of 2 or 3 men moving down the other side, and invariably the Germans were caught with their pants down and you could knock the machine gun out. The trouble was that every hedgerow had 2 or 3 of these machine guns on the far side. So you think you get away from one, and there was another one. And many of the fields had been harvested. They were going to put in a second crop, that type thing. And those you couldn't cross that way. You had to work your way down the hedges themselves.
So you had to fight your way through these hedgerows to reach the coastal road that you had mentioned?
The coastal road was the first objective, yes.
But did the hedgerows come after the coastal road?
Oh no, the hedgerows were right, probably within 20 feet of the bluffs. The first of the hedgerows would appear. They weren't as formidable as the ones when you got into the big farming spaces. Because if a farmer owned 3 of these, 3 small 100 by 200 yarders, if he owned them and they were adjacent, he would probably go in and take the rocks and put them around his property and making bigger hedgerows, but allowing him to farm the area that had been hedgerow. Get more money that way.
Yeah. So how many hedgerows did you guys have to cross, or open fields you had to cross?
We could look at it on that map there.
Okay. I'll grab that.
And there were plenty of them. I was in 1, 2, 3, 4 before we got to the coastal road.
And do you remember how many machine guns you guys?
No. We didn't have much. There were very few German positions short of the coastal road. They had set their first battle line, the hedgerows beyond the coastal road.
But eventually you made it to the coastal road.
Eventually we made it to the coastal road.
And you guys set up a position.
And crossing the fields, the machine guns broke out, and so send a patrol around, take care of the machine gun. People get up, suddenly a machine gun over here, send a platoon there, and before we knew it, we were spread out the wrong direction. But that was the reason for one of my idiot single-man patrols, was find out where the heck is the left flank of our battalion. Nobody knew, so I had to go find the left flank. And I walked down the coastal road until I found the left flank, and ran into a patrol from the 1st Division, complete with 3 paratroopers who had been dropped over 20 miles from where they were supposed to be dropped. So I could take that patrol in and say we've contacted the 1st Division.
And to that point, I understand a lot of units experienced a lot of confusion and mislanded where they were supposed to.
Oh yes, yeah. When we got to the top of the bluffs, because we'd gone through the smoke, we found units terribly intermingled, and C Company had intermingled with B Company and with D Company and E Company. A and B kind of managed to get to the top of the bluffs without intermingling with anybody. A was the left flank company, and so they were organized, ready to go. They went up through the smoke. One platoon got caught because as we got to the top of the bluffs, the battalion commanders put out the orders, stop. We're going to proceed as a battalion, not as platoons. A couple of platoons had escaped that and were already past the coastal road, so we'd lost at least one platoon from A Company. And a couple of other platoons we managed to catch and call them back. So we were now really 5 companies instead of 6 because we'd lost one platoon on the water.
And do you know what time of day it was when you reached the coastal road at that point?
Certainly by 9 o'clock. My recollection is my communications sergeant said it was 9 or 9:30, and he sent a message to Bradley. He had the call sign, have reached coastal road.
So it's probably about an hour and a half to 2 hours after you'd stepped foot on.
Yeah, we actually landed, our first group landed, I said 7:50 for us. They probably landed 10 minutes before we did. So 7:40, and 2 hours later we were at the road. And it was a mile, a good clean mile.
And what was the rest of the day like for you?
Well, for me, it was just tag along, walk down the ditches on the side of the coastal road using the hedgerows as protection from enemy fire. But even so, there was enough straggler fire and things like that that we had to duck walk most of the time and stay below the hedgerow itself, because the bullets were cutting through the hedgerows and things like that. And it was not organized fire, it was stragglers saying, I saw a helmet, and that type thing.
And where did you end the day?
Ended the day in Vierville, the far side of Vierville. The first main intersection beyond the main intersection. There's a farm there and a farm complex, and headquarters company took the farther farmyard and buildings, and headquarters itself took the other side of the crossroad. And it was there that we set up the first headquarters. I didn't have to do a damn thing. I mean, everybody went in and claimed their space, and that was all there was to it.
And did your unit take on any other casualties throughout the day?
My motor sergeant was killed at Vierville on the beach. Artillery fire. They landed at midnight, and that was my only other casualty that I had. But in the process, they brought in probably 10 jeeps and maybe 10 3/4 tons. Could have even brought in a couple of 1.5 tons, but I don't think so. Because the 1.5 tons, they carried the kitchen for the most part, and we still left them in England.
And looking back at the training that you guys went through, how well would you say that prepared you for what you actually experienced?
Training was everything. Nobody was really surprised by anything. It may have been a little more intense than we had hoped, But training was everything. People knew what their job was, they knew how to do it, and they did it. And training was what made me, within 10 seconds, realize that we were a mile away from the beach we were supposed to be on. That was training. As soon as I knew where I was, I knew how to get where I was supposed to be. Training. Incessant training, both physical and mental.
And with anything, you can do all the preparation in the world. There's bound to be obstacles. Like you said, you landed
Yeah.
where you were not supposed to. Were there any other things similar to that popped up that you had to adapt or react to that you may not have been prepared for?
Yeah, we were not prepared for the artillery fire that was hitting at the water's edge. Remember, artillery wasn't being wasted on the beaches. That was small arms fire that was coming in from our right. Artillery fire wasn't wasted on that because one shell might wound one man. Whereas if you hit one of those boats, you killed 15 and wounded 35. So the artillery was concentrated on the landing craft. And once you got away from that, you weren't bothered by artillery fire. Some people say that we had a lot of mortar fire. I do not remember any mortar fire when I was on the beach. There was artillery fire from inland, but let's face it, they had to cross the crest. The crest was steep, about 45 degrees, very close to that. I know we could not make it walking straight up. You had to sidestep up like skiers do. But the thing is that artillery, to clear that crest, the artillery shell went out into the water. So we didn't have to worry about real artillery fire on the beach. It was the stuff in the fortresses down there at the end of the beach that was our problem. And that was all direct fire, anti-tank fire. They had 88 guns and they had 76 anti-tank guns there and things like that. And that's whiz-bang, 2 seconds time of flight. Oops, we missed. Bang! This time you gotcha. So that's what was happening, and that's what Father Lacey was in for about 4 hours as he dragged people ahead of the tide. Fortunately, you get the high tide, then it starts going back out again. But he was pulling people forward of the tide, saying last rites over people.
And he survived the day?
And he survived the day and got a Distinguished Service Cross for it, which is the highest thing that was earned on Omaha Beach. There were no medals of honor. Well, it's not true. Johnny Monteith won a Medal of Honor in the 1st Division just below the Colville Cemetery down on the beach there. But in the 29th Division, there wasn't a Medal of Honor.
And you received the Silver Star?
Silver Star, that's the 3rd level. Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star.
And can you explain how the citation reads, or what you were awarded the Silver
Well,
Star for?
The Silver Star is for gallantry in action. And that means, well, it means just what the words say. You behaved yourself with disregard for your safety, really, in accomplishing the mission, and you accomplished your mission gloriously. You may or may not have survived. You may have been wounded. You may have been killed. In my case, I wasn't. But the point is that you didn't hesitate because of your fear of your own personal safety. That's about what gallantry in action is. Same thing for the enlisted men. They get Silver Stars for just approximately the same thing. The Distinguished Service Cross is a little different. I'm trying to think of the wording. I can get it for you, but I think it's called Gallantry and Intrepidity in Action. And that is to distinguish yourself above the ordinary guy who you have to decorate. very few Distinguished Service Cross people live through the action that they are famous for. But they do. They do live. And, but they've really done something. Ace Parker won a Distinguished Service Cross. He headed the A Company platoon that escaped the battalion on the beach because he didn't get the word that we were supposed to operate as a battalion. And he proceeded and actually got to Pointe d'Arc and reinforced with 30 men. Actually, by then he was down to 25 or so. But he reinforced the 2nd Rangers for their first night of counterattacks by the enemy. And for that, he got a Distinguished Service Cross, and he deserved it. Believe me, the things that he went through to get there, he deserved a Distinguished Service Cross. Bull Dawson got a Distinguished Service Cross. It was his 2 men that blew the hole in the wire, and he was the first man through the wire and went up, and as he got up to where the first enemy position was, he went and called for his grenadier. The grenadier fired a grenade. It was a dud. I think he failed to pull the pin. Really, I know the man. I think he forgot to pull the pin. And old Dawson said, "Never mind," and he went up there with his submachine gun and sprayed him. And that was the end of that. And he was really our first man to make a marked action against the enemy. And he got a Distinguished Service Cross, and he deserved it. I mean, absolutely fearless. He had 150 some night jumps in Vietnam. Special forces, night jumps, all with steerable parachutes. Can't believe it. But anyway, let's see who else. The chaplain won it. And of course, the battalion commander got a Distinguished Service Cross, and the executive got a Distinguished Service Cross. But the standards for that has more to do with leadership than actions. Whittington got a Distinguished Service Cross. He is the man who is supposedly famous for saying, let's see, the German word for surrender. He said, what the hell does that mean? But he didn't have an interpreter. But he got a Distinguished Service, and he deserved it. It was his company that led us off the beach, that led us through the bocage, that led us into the far bocage, which was fortified with machine guns. And on his own, he just withdrew, marched, went through Vierville. Nobody knew he had gone. But he said, my mission is to get to there, and I'm here. I'll have to go there. So, but he deserved a Distinguished Service Cross. He was an old China Marine. He was a Marine back in the days of the Panay incident and things like that, which you've never even heard of. You don't even know what the Panay incident is. But it was a very dangerous situation that grew when the warlords were attacking the U.S. river boats in China. And they captured the Panay, as I recall, and that almost led to us getting into a shooting war with the thousands and 10,000s and hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers. It was touch and go. Sand Pebbles. Have you seen the movie Sand Pebbles?
I have not.
No. You ought to see it. That is a story of the Panay, but with different names to things. Who's the guy that did The Great Escape? I can't even think of his name. But in any event, he did Sand Pebbles, and that's the story of a riverboat.
The director who did the movie, you mean?
I don't know. I was just thinking of the star.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But if you look up Sand Pebbles or see the movie, you will see about the Panay. It's a very, very interesting story. But anyway, Whittington was in that force that was over there, and it was very, very interesting. It was in the mid-30s when the Japanese were beginning to flex their muscles.
Now, I understand you've touched on a lot of it already, but for you, what was one of the toughest experiences on that day for you?
The toughest experience? The toughest experience was after I had, with my driver, I had gotten the Jeep off the beach, loaded it with mortar and machine gun ammunition, and we were driving down a road, 5 miles of it, with nothing but German stragglers in the field shooting at us all the time. And we came to one point where it was impossible to cross a particular blank area in the Jeep. It was just too long a distance. I mean, the machine gunners would get to you before you could get to the far end. There was a tiny bit of protection from a low hedgerow, a tiny bit of protection. So my driver and I, and this is hard to believe, we got out of the Jeep, we got under the Jeep, and we pushed the Jeep. Then we would scoot ahead and we'd push the Jeep another 3 feet, and we'd push the Jeep another 3 feet, all the time bullets hitting in the ammunition boxes. We could hear them, but we didn't have any grenades or anything like that. We just had mortar ammunition, which was high explosive, but it was on the bottom because it was heavier. And so we kept pushing and pushing, and we finally made the last of, I say 50 yards. It was probably less than 50, maybe 30. We finally made it to the far side where there was enough hedgerow protection, and we got back in the Jeep and we drove on until we overtook the Rangers that were ahead of us. And at that point we ran out of gas. I know it was a full tank when we started, so it must have been bullets hit the gas tank and the gas came leaking through. So we ran out of gas, abandoned the Jeep, but we did set up a little ammunition supply point, and the companies came in and got their ammunition.
So how did you retrieve the Jeep?
We didn't.
I mean, initially, how did you acquire the Jeep to begin with?
On the morning of D-Day, Major Sullivan told me to take a 4-man patrol and sweep the northern side of the coastal road up to the road that goes down to the coast, and then go to the 29th Division headquarters and report into that headquarters, give them our situation, give them our plans, and that was the extent of, and then return to the battalion. I took 2 master sergeants with me, plus my driver, Corporal Sharp, and we had a diamond patrol, Sharp point, 2 master sergeants to the right and left, and I in the middle back. And we did some 500 yards of patrol. We ran into a couple of German stragglers, engaged them in a firefight, chased them across the access road, pursued them to the military crest, and couldn't find anything there except a German Feldgrau hat with a bullet hole through it, and a few expended cartridge cases. But they had fled, so at that point we heard the battalion engines cranking up, the tanks cranking up, and the relief force to Pointe-aux was leaving. The 2 master sergeants said, "My job is down there, not on a stupid infantry patrol." So I released them, and then Sharp and I went down the access road to the 29th Division. We had to identify the World Series champions of 1932, and we had to identify Red Grange's number, which was 77, and a few things like that, and they finally cleared us to get in there. And I was in the G3 section starting my debriefing, and General Gerhardt walked in and said, "Raaen, come back to me, I want to talk to you." My father and he knew each other. And so I went back to General Gerhardt. I gave him our plans. I gave him our accomplishments. I gave him the fact Well, he said, okay, that's great. What can I do for you? And I said, we're out of ammunition. We couldn't get much ammunition last night on the beach. They wasn't organized. And he said, okay. And he called to his aide-de-camp, and he told the aide-de-camp, he says, take Captain Raaen down to the beach, find a vehicle for him, get it in operating shape, and take him to the ASP and load it up with mortar and with machine gun ammunition. So we did that, and that probably took an hour. You have to degunk these things. They had all kinds of wax and grease on the engine to protect the ignition systems and things like that when they were submerged. And so it took us a little while, and it took us a little while to manhandle all that ammunition. And then we proceeded back to Vierville, turned right, and went down the main coastal road. Came to a point where I had to decide, do I go right or left? So I dismounted, and there was brass down the left fork, there was brass down the right fork, no casualties, however, that I could see. And I finally, studying my map, I said, it's got to be the right fork. So I took the right fork, and it was correct. But all the time we were driving down that road, we were being shot at. I actually had my helmet hit by enemy rifle fire, and it was spun into my lap. So I caught it, looked at the dent, put it back on, and we proceeded. It was later that we did that lying on our backs, pulling the Jeep. So, but pulling the Jeep was about the most exciting thing that we did.
And this was on June 6th? This was later?
This is June 7th.
Okay.
It's the morning, and it's probably close to 10 o'clock-ish, maybe 11 o'clock-ish. I wasn't worried about time. I didn't particularly look at my watch. I did look at my watch the instant my foot hit dry ground. But after that, my watch may not have even been working by that. I don't know.
You had more pressing.
I had more important things to do. And by the way, it's unbelievable the number of things you can observe in a short period of time. I'll show it to you later. But I have a list of about 50 things that I saw in the first 2 minutes. And I remember them distinctly. Now, I didn't remember them 30 years ago distinctly, but during my research, every time I run upon a fact, I say, I remember that fact. Oh, my goodness, I'd forgotten so-and-so. And most of my memories are restored memories because somebody has given me a fact that triggered that memory.
Understandable.
Yeah.
So I'm going to fast forward a little bit. You mentioned earlier you were also involved in the Battle of the Bulge, or did your time end before?
The Battle of the Bulge. I was in the Battle of the Bulge for a short time. It started on the 16th of December, and I was injured on December 22nd. So I had 6 days of it. It wasn't the intense fighting that you hear about most of these units. We were actually below the area of German penetration. But defensively, the Germans strengthened the area that we were in with unbelievable reinforcements because they did not wish us to be able to cut off their things. So they built very, very high defensive positions. We had been able to send what I would call long-range reconnaissance patrols. We did call them that in Vietnam. But we had been able to send these long-range reconnaissance patrols that would go infiltrate through the German lines, maybe go 5-10 miles, and hole up in the woods and then count vehicles as they went by the intersections and things like that. And the next day, the next night, these troops would infiltrate back and bring all this German intelligence, even to what the units had as bumper markings and things like that, and the number of infantry reinforcements that were being moved and the number of tanks that moved and things like that. We've been able to move very freely with our long-range patrols. And on the night of December 16th, it would have to be the night of December 15th, we sent the patrols out. There wasn't a one of them that could get through the German lines. The Germans had stiffened their defenses with alternate and supplementary positions, so there just was no space to work through. And we reported that to Corps, and Corps said, "Oh, we got to find out what's happening." So they set up a box barrage. Do you know what a box barrage is?
No.
It's where you take several artillery batteries and you have them box in an area, a fairly large area. In this case, we did, I think, about a 200-yard across, 50-yard deep box barrage. And you just fire artillery shell and artillery shell into this border until you let up with the front artillery, and you move your troops in for a quick infantry attack before the enemy can get anything. And in this case, capture one German officer. That's all they asked of us. Meanwhile, the artillery is firing on the sides and probably on the rear. So the artillery is coming over your heads during a box barrage. You get in quick, you come back out. And as I say, we had a German major, took him, turned him over to Corps. We didn't know what happened after that. But of course, it was the Bulge. By then, they knew from other intelligence information that the Germans had attacked in force north of us.
So the box barrage is similar to what they would do with the anti-aircraft fire attacking bombers.
Yeah, up above. The same concept. But the concept is to make it impossible to reinforce the area that you're attacking.
Understood.
So we executed that on the 18th or the 19th, and I became a casualty on the 22nd. And the reason I became a casualty was very simple. The battalion got orders to move. We were placed on alert, like a 1-hour alert. I was at forward headquarters. My job was back at rear headquarters. So I called for a radio jeep, which was a 500 series radio, the kind that fills the whole back seat of a Jeep. I mean, it's a big radio, powerful. And that would mean that the forward headquarters would have communication with the rear headquarters, because I had several more of these big radios. And it was past midnight, and I started down the road with my driver. We decided to take the shortcut over the ridge. Very dangerous in the day. You didn't dare do it during the day. In fact, you didn't dare even have cat's eyes on, because the Germans would see the cat's eyes and open up artillery fire. But we were proceeding, doing very well, when all of a sudden I looked down at the speedometer and it said 45 or 50 miles an hour. And I said, "Hey, Eckern, slow down." And he said, "You told me to hurry." And just at that exact moment, the Jeep that I'd called for met us bumper to bumper, doing the same 55. And we had 2 dead Jeeps, 4 injured Rangers, and that was the end of my war, right then and there.
Were you ejected?
I was ejected back to the right rear. My driver was not ejected. He had a broken leg. I had a broken leg. Sergeant Graves in the passenger side of the other Jeep had 2 broken legs, and Moyer, the other driver, was absolutely knocked silly. "Captain, what do you want me to do, Captain?" And I'd tell him, and he'd say, "Captain, what do you want me to do?" And he'd come back over and over again. And I said, "Well, I'll tell you, Moyer." And what are we talking? We're talking a minute and a half, 2 minutes. And I said, "Moyer, come down beside me and lie down here in the ditch, and you and I can moan until somebody comes to rescue us." And would you believe it, within a period of a couple of minutes, the place was loaded with medics. And I said to one of the stretcher bearers, a non-com, I said, where the hell are you guys from? And they said, oh, after dark we moved into that farmhouse over there. And I said, do you know that that farmhouse is under direct artillery fire from the Germans, and that the only reason we were on this road was because the Germans can't see us in the dead dark? I said, you've got to get your commander to move you out before daylight or every one of you is dead. So they took and evacuated me to first Forbach, and then to Metz, and then to Paris, and then to England, and then finally to Walter Reed. Exciting times.
Sounds like it. And your military career went on for years and years later. And did you serve? You served during the Korean War?
I served in the Korean War. I served in the Vietnamese War.
Did you serve in combat in both of those?
Definitely not combat in Korea. In Korea, I went over after the armistice was signed. So what I was there for was the cleanup. And maybe I told you, and maybe I told somebody else, we were living off cannibalization in Korea when I got there. We had 10 divisions, and there were only two divisions left. And rather than send us spare parts, they said cannibalize the abandoned equipment. And we had 8 divisions of abandoned equipment. Well, the cannibalizable stuff was about running out when I got there. And what I did was, through a great deal of energy that I had in those days, I convinced the people in Japan that the pipeline needed to be restored, that we could no longer live on cannibalization, that there just weren't the critical items there, and our deadlines were like 25% deadlines in every unit that we had. Why? Because the 25% that was deadline because we cannibalized the damn things off of them to keep the rest of the fleet going. So I convinced them to reestablish the pipeline, not only of repair parts, but also of major vehicle items and things like that. That was my biggest accomplishment there. I also was the only person who understood the new Army Field Stock Control system. And so I helped people use that in the ordnance and support units. It was not just ordnance, it was actually a quartermaster invention, not an ordnance invention. And I helped people do that. We also had gone to the new stock item numbering system, and that just created havoc all over the place with what few supplies we had. Suddenly it had a new number, and people would requisition the old number, and we'd have the new number, but we wouldn't know that the new number was a replacement for the old number, and I had to straighten that out. And I understood, and I found out a few things that were done in the transition which made it very easy to convert from the old system to the new system. But at first, nobody knew.
And when did you reach the rank of Major General?
Well, I went through Vietnam. I was a colonel. And during my Vietnam tour, I was selected to be a brigadier general. I came back, served in the Pentagon for a year, and they put me out then into St. Louis, where I was a commanding general of the Mobility Equipment Command, which meant I had life cycle management for engineer equipment, most of it, most quartermaster equipment, most transportation corps equipment other than aircraft. I didn't have anything to do with aircraft, and things like that. And I was there for about a year, and they moved me to the Weapons Command in Rock Island, which was pure ordnance. And while I was there, they made me merge the Munitions Command with the Weapons Command and into a thing they called the Armament Command, which was life cycle management for all weapons and ammunition. And believe me, that was a tough job. I had 85,000 employees or troops, and many of these were what we call GOCO operators. We had ammunition plants, for example, where we would have a military commander there with a staff of perhaps 10 people. and they would contract with a GOCO operator who would bring in 300 workers and operate the ammunition lines. Well, I'm including those people we brought in because they were essentially under my contracts. About 85 to 95,000, closer to 85, I would guess. That was a big command. You can't imagine how many $1 billion I had in my budget, but it was a lot of billions.
And then, was it 1979?
Yeah.
You retired?
I retired. I left the Armament Command and was sent to the Defense Supply Command, a DSC we called it, Defense Supply Command. And they handled all common logistics. By common, I mean screws, nails. In a sense, they handled such things as a mobile hospital. They handled all the food procurement for the armed services. They handled, as I say, all the common hardware. They handled much of the equipment. They procured all the fuel, and later I went to the fuel center, and they handled all the fuel for the federal government. So Defense Supply Agency, or Defense, that agency, I said C, Defense Supply Agency was a big, big job. I was the deputy to the director of that. And later, when they brought in an Army director, they said, we can't have Army in both jobs, you got to go away. So I went to the Defense Fuel Supply Center, which procures and distributes all fuel, to include coal, all lubricants. It does not include rocket fuel, but it includes every other type of hydrocarbon fuel. For the federal government, I was sending boats, flatboats up the Yukon River with 55-gallon cans of kerosene that we would dump overboard for the Indians so that they could get through the winter. That type thing. I mean, think of all those post office trucks, how many we have and where they are. They got their gasoline from me. I mean, nobody understands how massive the logistics system is that we built in the Department of Defense.
And you were groomed in that from a very young age.
Oh yeah. Yes, I was an expert in procurement, in logistics, in research and development, and in ammunition. Those were my main specialties that I tried to stay in after I left the infantry.
Seems as if you were destined for this type of career from the very beginning.
I was destined for this easy chair, the fact that it is however I want it.
Well, I'd like to ask you if you have any advice for my generation and future generations. What would you be able to offer us?
Well, actually, I have conflictions here. There are two things. One is Constitution. The Constitution is a great document, particularly in its three branches of government, where two branches keep the third branch under control. I think that the constitutional form of government that we have is invaluable, and I think that every young person should, somewhere around the 6th grade, when you get your introduction to civics, ought to be introduced more into government and into the Constitution and understand why the Constitution is so great. It is the thing that made this country great with respect to the rest of the world. The other thing, which I see has disappeared almost, is patriotism. That's why I say I'm conflicted. I don't know which is the more important. The rules under which patriotism has to act, the Constitution, or whether the patriotism that supports the Constitution and has it continue in operation without being changed by all these people that say, oh, it should be a living document that should reflect the fact that we use yellow lights in traffic control now at intersections. No. I think that the basic Constitution should be a framework to which laws are attached. And in that sense, I think the Supreme Court is a very, very important organization. Probably the most important organization of the three is the Supreme Court. Anybody can be president. We proved that several times. Anybody can be president if he is an accomplished enough manager. Anybody can get into Congress and make laws. And we've proved that particularly recently. Anybody can get in. But most of these people that I'm worried about are not patriots. And I don't want to see a bunch of non-patriots in Congress. We've got to do something about that. And I'm hoping that your generation will wake up to the fact that we don't want our socialism here. We don't want a bunch of traitors who are trying to undermine the government, undermine the president, undermine the military, do anything to bring in immigrants so that they can get them to vote and vote us in type. No. But those two things, I think, are the main things that we've got to worry about. And you asked a question about cadets. Cadets take exactly the same oath of office as the president.
Is there anything else that you would like to add that we haven't touched on?
Yeah, I was interviewed at Fort Benning once. It was at I think it was a graduation ceremony of a Ranger class. And they had the usual demonstration. And I was interviewed by a young blonde woman from Fox. And she was most impressive. I've been told I'm going to be interviewed by her again in France when I go over there this next month. And she asked a question, and I had not expected it. And she said, how would you compare yourself, World War II Rangers, with today's Rangers? And I didn't have to think. The words just came out. They're bigger than we were. They're smarter than we were. They're better trained than we were. They're better equipped than we were. They're better informed than we were. Frankly, if we fought them in a battle, we'd last about 10 minutes. I think it's important to think on that. And if you're talking about special forces compared to the Rangers of World War II, I mean, I gave you miles apart with just the Rangers, the way the Rangers are today. The special forces are that much better than the Rangers. It's unbelievable, the strides that have been made in weaponry, in training, things like that. This country, if the radical left would allow it to proceed as the right had done it, and there are things wrong with the right. We just can't afford to have that radical left take over the agenda of government or of patriotism or anything like that, because they are not patriots. They are all very selfish. They're looking for the day that I can get control of whatever it is I want control of. And in socialism, you very quickly get control. The people are slaves, essentially. Did I have one more thing? I can't think of it. Okay. See, that's one of the troubles when you get to be 97 and you're talking about something and you get interrupted. You have to look at your audience and say, what the hell was the subject we were talking about? So if you don't know what the subject was and I hadn't expressed it, you couldn't.
Well, you're very impressive,
no,
97 or not.
Yeah, you forget a lot of things. You forget a lot of things. But
so you'll be making the journey back to
yeah,
France?
I'll be going back June 3rd, be there, come back the 7th. and I'll go to Pointe-aux and participate in some ceremonies they have there, and then go to Colville and be, I hope, in the audience there. When I say I hope I have no duties to perform because I'm not prepared.
Have you been back since?
I've been, this will be my 8th time that I've been in Normandy. I'm counting the invasion as the first time. We didn't have passports in the invasion.
Didn't need them back then.
No.
There's nobody to ask for them.
Right.
Well, I want to thank you very, very
Well,
much.
you're welcome.
For having me in your home.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you very much for your service.
Okay, how? We were presented the maps like this because okay. Here is Pointe-aux. And Pointe-aux turns out to be approximately 5 miles from Vierville. And Vierville is the beginning of the invasion beaches. The guns at Pointe-aux had a range of 10 miles. So they could not only make Vierville, they could go 5 miles beyond, which was farther than Omaha Beach extended. So they could cover the entire Omaha Beach with what we call enfilade fire. Now, artillery and small arms, but particularly artillery, does not miss right and left. Most artillery misses only long and short. The probable error at 5 miles might be 5 yards to the right and 5 yards to the left. But the probable error in range might be 150 yards. So enfilade fire is going to get a long target. Even if you miss this part of the target, you hit that part of the target, or you hit that part of the target. And since there's no breadth to the target here, enfilade fire is utterly deadly, absolutely deadly. So that's what we had here from Pointe-aux. If you look, it is a straight line down that beach, straight line down that beach. They also, and we can't show it here, but Utah Beach was over here, and it was oriented this way, so that the guns at Pointe-aux were firing into the backs of the troops. Now, true, it was not enfilade fire, but there's nothing worse than hearing that shell come in from behind you. That's terrifying. So, and they had the whole of Utah Beach within the range of the guns at Pointe-aux, which happens to be 12,740 yards, if I recall. So that was the problem that they had with the invasion. They did not think they could take it by aerial drop. There were just too many parachute traps all over this area. Didn't think they could take it by naval gunfire, because to use naval gunfire would tip their hands, where are we going? So they organized 2 Ranger battalions in the States to handle the Pointe-aux problem. And the Pointe-aux problem was originally settled by 3 companies of the 2nd Battalion would assault both sides of the Pointe-aux cliffs. Another company of the 2nd Battalion would attack at Vierville and move this direction and clear out the artillery that's up in here, Pointe-aux. There was quite a bit of artillery and signal emplacement here. 2 more companies of the 2nd Battalion and the 5th Battalion, all 6 companies, would land at Vierville, pass through the infantry troops who had already taken the Vierville exit, march down this road, combat style, as fast as we could, get to Pointe-aux, and attack it from the rear if the 2nd Battalion hadn't succeeded. So that was the plan, and I'm just going to look to see who this is. I don't care, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to talk to them. So there is that. When we came in, we circled about here, probably 15 minutes away from Pointe-aux. halfway, I saw this point so often that it was just unbelievable. I never saw this. This is hardly visible from the water, hardly visible. And the 2nd Battalion, unfortunately, instead of going here, was sent here because the navigator. Have you got a copy of my book?
I do, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll sign it for you if you have it.
I would very much appreciate that.
If you have it.
I do.
But anyway, they went here because of a navigational error, and it took them another half hour to get here. And they landed here actually 41 minutes late. They started the landing, but they had been shot at by all the German troops along this crest all the way. Supplies had been lost, and they had taken enough casualties already that when they landed at Pointe du Hoc, they couldn't have a two-cliff landing. That everybody had to go up the same cliffs and things like that. It was called a mess. And the old adage is that plans are wonderful things until the first shot is fired, and at that point they should be consigned to the furnace. So anyway, we came in to Vierville, got waved off, came in here. The 2nd Rangers, 2 companies, landed there and were cut to pieces. We moved over here another 800 yards and landed here. Went across, you can count the fields. I hit right here. In my book, you'll see I went on a patrol on a diagonal path. I did that alone. And then we moved up this field right here, the fun, where my fingernail is, through that field, and we were at the coastal road. And you can see, if this is a 10,000 meters, and it is, these are 1,000 meters, not 10,000, 1,000 meters. This is 1,000 meters. We were 1,000 meters in. That's close to 1,200 yards. These are big fields. I mean, they are not little farm fields like we think of. They are big, big, massive fields. We proceeded down the road to this little place right here, and this is where I set up for the night, and the battalion headquarters was in that building. And the 29th Division did not like what they saw with respect to the German reaction, and they were afraid they would be counterattacked with armor D-Day night, so they kept the entire 5th Battalion here. And the next morning, we, with the 1st Battalion of the 116th, started a 29th Division attack toward Pointe du Hoc to relieve them, and continuing on to Granville, and continuing on to Isigny. And unfortunately, just as the advance party reached this point here, approximately, a German counterattack came. And so they let only the advance guard of that relief force or task force go. And they kept the rest of them, had to keep the rest of them in Vierville or lose the bridgehead. So only the 2nd Ranger Provisional Company, the 1st Battalion, 116th Infantry, and 2 5th Battalion companies were in that force, plus 8 tanks. And they actually got all the way down here to where they could see Grand Camp, well past Pointe du Hoc. It was a conflict of missions. The 29th Division mission was Grand Camp. The 5th Ranger mission was Pointe du Hoc. So we ended up with the Rangers here. The tanks were gone, and we waited overnight, and the next morning we attacked Pointe du Hoc and relieved them. But meantime, the main force had come up with the tanks again. We were there. But I just thought you might like